Butter. It's one of the most common ingredients in 18th century cookbooks. They'll use it in almost every type of recipe. It doesn't matter whether it's a savory thing or it's a sweet dish, butter shows up over and over again. There's a common misconception that poor people couldn't afford butter in the 18th century, that it was so expensive that poor people didn't bother to use it. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Even if it was not an inexpensive product, and there were different grades of it, you could buy inexpensive butter, it was used whether they liked it or not. There are some things that were expensive that people just would not do without, and butter is one of them. So why is butter so important in the 18th century? Well, butter brings in a lot of different components. It'll give you flavor and oils into recipes that are hard to get there in other ways. Today we have other oils that we would use in cookery, but in the 18th century, they had very few oils to work with. They had salad oil, which was olive oil, they had suet, they had lard, and they had butter. Now, these other ones bring in flavor components that you don't want in a lot of different kinds of recipes. So butter is the go-to. It's got this flavor that we already enjoy. It's generally got a little bit of saltiness or a lot of saltiness, sometimes in the 18th century. So it's bringing in the salt too. It'll take a dry meat cut and it'll make it moist and it'll give it extra flavor. So it's used in all sorts of recipes, but it's also used almost by itself. There's some people that will pretty much just eat butter right off of the knife. And that happens in the 18th century a lot, as well as a simple meal being nothing but bread and butter. That is so common. We'll see that in writings in the 18th century. Somebody orders up a drink and bread and butter. That's it. That's their complete meal. When we think about the dairy products that all come together that are typical for the 18th century, people are going to be having milk, they'll have something like cream, they have butter, and they have cheese. Well, cheese is really good for long-term preservation of milk products, but it's a very complicated product to make. It takes a long time for aged cheeses to be good, and even green cheeses, there's a lot of technique and skill to create those cheeses properly. Now, milk and cream, those are great, but they go bad very quickly. So if we take that cream and we turn it into butter, we can make that very, very easily with almost no equipment at all, and we can make it last a great deal of time by just adding salt. So what is butter? Butter is just the fat molecules kind of separated out of this raw milk that comes out of the cow. This is a process where it takes many different stages. First, we have to separate out the cream from the milk, and then that cream is treated in a special way and put into a churn, or sometimes it can be done with even simpler equipment, but then we agitate that in such a way that those fat molecules kind of come together and lock together and separate from the buttermilk, the water portion of the cream, and then we have just the butter portion. And in the 18th century, and especially in some hotter climates, they would even break that down further. They would melt that butter and turn it into ghee, or in other places, they would just use it in cooler countries, just use it as the butter here. Now, butter is very, very popular as a food item in the 18th century, but much earlier than that, hundreds of years earlier, butter isn't necessarily a food product. Many times it's used as a fuel more than it's used as a food. But here in the 18th century, it's just a wonderful food product. Another misconception, I think, is that we see the world of the 18th century and everybody's just a small farm. Everybody has one or two cows, and so they might make their own butter. I don't know about North America per se. It may be a little bit more like that in North America. But in Great Britain, dairy farms are larger farms. They might not have 200 cattle, but they'll likely have a dozen or 20 or 30 cows. And that's where most of these dairy products are really coming from. So in this 18th century setting, a farmer who has a dozen cows, he's not going to be making all these things every day. A dairy farmer's job is one that's very, very time oriented. The cows have to be milked twice a day. and the milk is going to go bad. They don't have refrigeration like we do. They might have a spring house that has a cooler temperature, but they certainly can't get things very cold. So both the cows have to be dealt with at a very timely manner, and the product you get from the cows has to be dealt with in a very timely manner. So you only get a certain quantity of cream from a gallon of milk, and you don't have enough cream to start making butter right away. So a farmer is going to have to sort of gather up his cream over multiple days. The problem is that cream might go bad in as soon as a day or two. And so they had to figure out ways of treating that cream so that it didn't go bad. Sometimes they would do a light heating or almost a boil on their cream. What they were probably doing was pasteurizing it, but they didn't know it. So there were instructions in 18th century books specifically for dairy farmers saying, well, you can take that cream and you can boil it to one wallop. Imagine that. You're boiling something and then you see one bloop, bubble come to the top. Okay, good enough. It's heated, I can set this aside, and then tomorrow I can add tomorrow's cream to it, and then maybe I'll have enough to make my butter. Our butter making process is incredibly simple. It doesn't use very many pieces of equipment. We really just need a churn. Now, there are different kinds of churns in the 18th century. There is the classic style of upright churn that we all think of when we see a butter churn. Either they can be tall and skinny. I've got this one here that's ceramic, and it's a nice small tabletop household style churn. It doesn't make very much butter at a time, maybe a pound max. But that's perfect for this situation. They would have much larger churns. So even these upright churns, they make 10 pounds or 12 pounds of butter at a time, and you'd have to sit down and work this churn. There even was large upright churns that would use a sweep, a lever that would turn it up and down to make it easier to do. But in the 18th century, there was an invention, possibly in the 17th century, but certainly getting popular in the 18th century, was the rotary churn, which is so much easier to use. Might be hard to clean out, but they used these to make 50 or 60 or 70 pounds of butter at a time. There were even larger sorts of rotary churn versions that we see in Diderot's encyclopedia. It's hard to say exactly how these worked. We're going to be using this little household version because it's very easy to clean out. You do want to churn in some place that isn't too smoky or smelly. Although occasionally we see images of people churning butter out in the barnyard or in strange places. We can kind of take our butter churn with us and do this. It takes a while. It is something that is a mindless job to do, but it's going to take a minimum of 30 minutes and possibly a good bit longer than that. So it's something that you can take with you and talk with people while you're doing it, or supervise children doing work or whatever while you're churning the butter, possibly making the children churn the butter. But it is going to take probably at least a half hour, and generally when I've done it with this little household churn, it takes 35 minutes to 45 minutes before we start to form the butter. We're going to pour in our cream, and our cream should be somewhere around room temperature, somewhere between 65 and 70 degrees is probably best. We need to churn our butter at a very consistent speed. I'm probably going at about 100 beats per minute on this, and that seems like it's going to work. I don't know, it really does change a little bit with the cream. Now, speaking to the cream just a second here, I know that most people here don't have access to raw milk and raw cream. So in this episode, I'm using standard store-bought heavy cream just to make sure it works. I have tried with some different kinds of store creams and they don't work. So if you try this at home, even shaking it in the jar method or whatever, and it doesn't form up butter, try a different brand of cream and you'll probably have some luck. So standard store-bought cream will work just fine for that. If it's too cold, below 65 degrees, you'll have more difficulty. If you have it too warm, it won't make a very good butter. We're just gonna keep at a very consistent rate. If you get past 35 minutes and it's just doing exactly the same thing, try speeding up a touch. That will probably help. Our butter doesn't look like it's doing anything for a long time. And then all of a sudden, all the butter starts to form up properly. We do want to be very, very consistent. If you stop and set it aside, you'll basically lose all your progress. You'll have to start over from the beginning. At some point, after 30 minutes, it will start to sound a little different and it will feel different. You can really kind of tell that the thickness changes and we really get the clumpiness of the butter and the thin buttermilk separating. And just keep going for a little bit and it will form up the butter a little bit tighter and the buttermilk. You can probably keep going a little bit further than I have with this particular batch because once we turn this out and we sort of get the butter to form up on the plunger, we're gonna put it into a bowl and work on separating this butter from the buttermilk a little bit more. And what's happened here is that there's still buttermilk all throughout the butter. And now we can kind of press this out with our hands. We can just sort of squeeze it. I'm using a spoon here. They used butter paddles in the 18th century to sort of, I don't know, squeeze the buttermilk out of this. And you can kind of see as it sets here, little bits of buttermilk just sort of form on the outside of the butter and run down into the bowl. Now, there are times in the 18th century where they have directions for washing the butter. They will put this under basically running water or in cold water and massage this butter to get the buttermilk out. But the directions say specifically that the butter won't last as long. If you're using it immediately within the next couple of days, that works fine. But if you're storing butter like that, then it will go rancid much more rapidly. They use the term it rusts or it reeses. We know that as rancidness. And probably what was happening is the water was bringing in different kinds of bacteria. And that's what they were kind of seeing here. Possibly if we used something very, very sterile, maybe, distilled water or something. But in the 18th century, those were the directions. Buttermilk is our byproduct that comes out of the butter, and we've got buttermilk here. Now, if you buy buttermilk from the store, it is cultured. It is a completely different product. I mean, it looks like milk, right? It just tastes like whole milk. It's what's left out of the cream when you take out all those solids. So it's just basically milk. It's fine. If you look in the 18th century books, now maybe when they churned their butter, they were able to get a thinner buttermilk, basically almost a skimmed milk out of it. And sometimes they talk about just basically getting rid of it, giving it to the animals or whatever. There are some recipes though. William Ellis specifically has multiple recipes that use buttermilk. You don't see buttermilk showing up in a lot of the standard cookbooks in the time period like you do today. Again, totally different product. Now, what about the storage of the butter? This is very, very important. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we make butter in the first place. So they did mention the times when you would use butter almost immediately, within a couple of days. You would just lightly salt it then, just basically to give it enough taste to it. So we all want a little bit of saltiness to our butter, at least I certainly do, and they did in the 18th century. But most of the time, the butter for any length of time was salted much more heavily than we even think of today. They would have a vessel that they're going to store their butter in. They would have put a layer of salt at the bottom and then put in a layer of butter and then more salt and then more butter, so that they didn't necessarily sort of churn it into it, but they would have these thinner layers of butter with salt in between. But this butter could last a long time. Not refrigerated, but at room temperature. Butter was sold, at least in a commercial sense, in a wholesale sense, in barrels that were 8 gallons. They're called a firkin, and it would hold about 56 pounds of butter. So that's typically what you would see. Now, sometimes you'll see references to tubs of butter, and this was an official measurement, I believe, of about 2 pounds. But most of the time, if you're looking at butter references, so if you go to some place like the Old Bailey, which has crime records from London and from England in that time period, you'll find multiple references. I mean, a lot of references to people stealing butter, and it will say he stole 56 pounds of butter, or he sold twice that much. He's stealing a firkin of butter. So we churned some butter. Now let's find out what this butter tastes like, the stuff we made today. Got a nice little kind of normal piece of bread here. That is extraordinary butter. This is a fun project to make something just like they would have done in the 18th century. You don't have to have a butter churn like this. You can do it in a regular mason jar and you just shake it until the butter starts to form on the inside. It is fun and it is very, very tasty.